I want to get this thing going off by inviting three outstanding panelists. I'm going to invite Jess Christensen from Bayer.
Got to cheer on my fellow panelists.
Morning, Jess. I'll have you sit there. Joel from Burger King. And Mac Marshall from the United Soybean Board. So Jess, Joel, and Mac, the conversation that I'd love to have is starting off with each of your companies have made big promises to achieve net zero by a certain timeline. You've been busy at it, trying to make it happen. And as you have engaged in that journey, love to start with you sharing what have you learned about what it's going to take to make that happen, and some of the things that look good in the beginning, and now as you got into it, it's looking a little different. So in a very transparent and real way, love to share with you the problem that you see with this promise that has been made.
All right, I'll kick it off. Hey, everybody. I wore my comfortable shoes for all my steps, Vijay, since you were. But yeah, so I lead communications at Bayer Crop Science. Before that was running our sustainability strategy team. So when we think about net zero, Bayer, like most companies, has a net zero target by 2050. When we first got into this, we said, all right, there's some things we can control, our own operations. We're a big, huge company. We have a crop science division, a consumer health, and a pharmaceuticals division. So in crop science, which is where I work, we were looking at our own operations and what we can optimize, investment in green energy, updates, capital infrastructure. Okay, so we had a lot of things that were progressing nicely. What we realized is the value chain component is hard. And I think that's why a lot of us are sitting here today. If you think about how many suppliers we have, and I think, Joel, you can speak to this from your guys' own lens too, thousands and thousands. And not having the right data systems, the right footprinting mechanisms makes this extremely cumbersome to figure out how and where to start, and honestly, how to track it and account for it. So that's one of the challenges. The other opportunity we saw was, okay, yep, we as a company need to have good corporate citizenship. We need to do the right things around environmental, social, and governance when it comes to our sustainability strategy. We could do a lot more if we really, truly enable our farmers, which is what we do. We innovate for farmers, for production. And so if we really want to have scale, when you think about the climate crisis, and climate's just not about greenhouse gas either, to Vijay's earlier comment. That's the other complexity. We're like, okay, we got water, we got soil health, biodiversity. So how do we think about the nexus of all that coming together? So really, we started thinking about, okay, if we want to have great positive impacts, we got to truly enable farmers to do this. And that will have big scale. So our own footprint is excellent. We're going to continue that. That's when we thought, all right, we got to really, really start partnering in a different way because we can't do this alone, not only for our own operations, but certainly enabling our producers. So that was one of the big challenges we took upon ourselves. So we have commitments as a company for our own operations around several sustainability areas, but also we've put skin in the game saying, hey, we're going to help the downstream, our farmers' footprints. And we know we don't control that. Our farmers do, right? So we basically are saying we're going to measure how successful our farmers are at helping to solve some of these crises. To do that, we have to work together. So looking forward to the discussions today, you guys. A lot of opportunity here. As Bob said, for those who were at the reception last night, he gives his regards. He was hoping to be here this morning, but I think he summarized it well. We know there's a huge challenge in front of us. We have to produce more to really sustain the population growth, and we have to do that within the planetary boundaries. Okay, we like challenges. We can do hard things together. You got that. We have to make this pragmatic and simple for growers, and we get that feedback all the time. Super complicated, don't know, like they've got their own livelihoods first and foremost, but our growers are really innovative entrepreneurs. So how do we tap into that and make it easy for them to help scale this? And the third is transparency and trust. we have to be honest about the complexities. We have to be open to partnering in a different way if we're going to do this in a faster time frame, which is absolutely critical. So I'll stop there, Vijay, but thanks for the question.
Well, thanks for setting the table for a new and enhanced model of collaboration than when you all started the journey, now coming into shape. And you're not alone. As we heard in our coalition meeting, all our corporations are realizing that we're going to have to enhance the level of collaboration and innovation, right? So Joel, from Burger King's perspective, major promises at the shareholder level.
Indeed.
And then why don't you talk about what your day job is at Burger King and what the reality looks like from where you sit.
Happy to do it. So greetings from Miami. I did bring the 70-degree weather that's coming on Friday, so congratulations. But no, really a pleasure to be here. My journey to get here has been an interesting one. I've got a lot of fond memory here in St. Louis. My first few years of marriage was in Central West End, where my wife was attending graduate school there at WashU, and so ran and operated businesses in South County as well as in Southeast Missouri, where we raised our family. So I've been in Miami for 5 years, and I lead the supply chain team for Burger King North America, which includes Canada and Mexico. So I've got 100 staff members that are responsible for all procurement within everything soup to nuts, whether it's construction-related items, proteins, food and packaging items that are actually in the restaurants across North America here. We do have a fairly large target. So one of the things I inherited as a franchisee coming into this role was the commitment that was made by predecessors in regards to the carbon reduction and some of the other sustainability objectives, whether it be cage-free eggs, whether it be sow housing, soup to nuts. And so we've identified that we have to solve this and work with partners further upstream in order to actually come to a conclusion that we actually achieve these objectives. We've got some pretty big targets on our back. So 14% of our emissions is done via the restaurants themselves. So you think about the physical buildings and the assets themselves. 84% is my team's responsibility. That's the supply chain emissions, and the rest of it for RBI is basically what they do internally. So it's the cars they drive in their offices and so forth. So fairly small portion. So when you think about this 84% and this target on us, it's how do we reduce emissions, and then how do we increase sequestration? So I got my new best friend, Dr. Troy, that I met a few minutes ago, and he was teaching me in regards to different things that could reduce, obviously, emissions via health of the animals and so forth, and some of the innovation that's happening. And so we're super excited. It's been an interesting journey to actually sit up here and the connections. If I told you how I actually got connected with REACH, you wouldn't believe it. But long and short with it, couldn't be more excited about the opportunity to meet many professionals in this room today, learn from you, and hopefully find a way that we can scale the journey and education to the consumer. Because that's one of the things that I think we realize, and I'm governed by 21 franchisees that are owner-operators of the restaurants across the continent here, and are not 100% believing that their end consumer is actually going to pay a premium for these types of objectives and so forth. So we've got to obviously educate the business owners, right? Those that are obviously operating these restaurants and these consumer businesses, but also educate the consumers that this is going to come at a cost, right? And how we progress with that moving forward is going to be super critical. But really excited to be here. Look forward to learning from each of you today and hopefully finding some new partners in the future forward.
I remember, Joel, in our inaugural meeting, how the consumer-facing organizations were all coming to the realization that right now we don't have a path for the consumer to pay more for this, right? And so hoping that will change is one strategy.
Yeah.
But dealing with maybe it won't. And then how do we then make the entire system much more efficient than it is today?
Right.
But if you're going to do it on the back of our producers, that's not going to work, right? This is why we are building this coalition to not just hope that this thing is going to go away with these promises. So want to make this a real conversation. And the third leg of this is the voice of the producer. So Mac, you are at the USB. And from where you all sit, what are your members hearing in the push and pull of this regen story, with people showing up on your farms and saying, we want you to do this, and one day it looks like they're making sense, and the next day it looks like they just don't understand how we do it. Can you just help our audience understand what this looks like, and what are some mistakes that are being made in how folks are thinking about this, if they were addressed, could lead to a new approach?
Yeah, fantastic question. And I think first, by way of background, I should have full disclosure. I don't come from an agricultural background. I was born on the East Coast. Actually, Joel and I were talking before we got started here and kind of sharing stories around how we've come to where we are now. I worked in government for a long time on the East Coast. That's what gave me my introduction to agriculture, is just looking at data and statistics and learning more and more about ag markets, okay? Food and production, that just kind of happens out in a vacuum. I'm not really connected to it. And then 10 years ago, an opportunity comes at Monsanto in the corporate strategy group, and I come out to St. Louis, and that's when I start to get closer to producers. I always felt growing up that I could do anything that I wanted except be a doctor because I'm squeamish. And then I think after my first trip to a farm and actually meeting producers and hearing what their year-round calendar looks like, because it's not just time in the field, it's preparation and planning for the successive crop season. Oh, and by the way, because you're a farmer, you're intrinsically connected to every point of the value chain because every part of the value chain needs what you produce. That's a hell of a lot of input coming in, and it's a lot for farmers to manage. So very quickly into my, agribusiness career, I realized I could never be a farmer as well. And so now, working on staff at the United Soybean Board, I lead market intelligence, which is basically looking across commodity markets and looking at value-added streams that are out there and helping provide counsel to our board of directors on best paths for investing for the future of soy. And so, my comments and sentiments here around the need for a truly farmer-centric system, a lot of it's going to derive from things that you've heard from Jess and Joel at this point. And I'm really glad that, in other parts of the value chain, whether downstream or upstream, there's a recognition and understanding of the need for producer centricity. A couple things that I've just observed over time. We were joking about Missouri being the show me state. Well, I'd say farming is the show me vocation. It's the way of life. If you see a farmer who adopts a new technology and it takes off, well, guess what? You've got this ripple effect in the farms around it. If you've got a farmer who adopts a new technology and it's confusing and doesn't provide the right guidance, doesn't give them the right ROI, you're not going to see that S-shaped adoption curve that we're all so fond of talking about in the ag tech space. It's really important, and I'll focus on the US here. 2% of the population is farmers. And I think it's really, really easy and the default approach for any of us operating in other parts of the value chain, whether we're a consumer or anything between the retail point of sale and the farm gate, it's very easy to forget and take for granted what farmers do to make food production happen. And it's not just food production, it's energy production, it's feed production, it's fiber production. All of that addresses the key needs of humanity. I don't need to belabor the 10 billion by 2050 point or anything. But that all starts with our farmers. Any value being created, anything that is going to deliver against mitigating scope 3 emissions, you look upstream in your value chain and you will eventually get to a farmer. And that is a solutions provider. And that's how we're looking at this as US Soy. US Soy as a solution provider. We're an ingredient, we're hidden, but through carbon saving practices that our farmers implement and execute every single day, and growing development of those practices and growing reach and spread, that's part of the solution set that emanates on farm and transmits to the whole value chain. So
Mac, I don't want to let you off the hook here. So if it is, why is it that when we talk to producers about regen ag, it feels like something is being done to them?
Well,
when the real framing is.
I think nomenclature matters, and I think the approach matters. I've heard it said at a board meeting, why are we talking so much about sustainability? That's just a fancy word for doing things the right way that we've done for generations.
There you go.
And I'd say without paying homage to that, and this is one of the confusing things that I think exists in carbon programs is, if a farmer's been investing towards doing the right things on land for multiple generations, because of the way that I'd say credit systems and everything is set up, it's all about, okay, what is new? What else have you done? What more can you do? Well, farmers are already endogenizing, I'd say, the greatest share of risk within the value chain. And when there's a request that says, hey, further down the line, this is what our consumers are clamoring for. These are the Scope 3 claims that we want to make for being carbon neutral. If those are commitments that are being made without understanding what can be done at the farm level, then farmers get boxed out. And that creates a fraught system. Either you've alienated the most important part of the value chain, or you've set up an environment where the aspirational goals that are really important for mitigating climate change and I'd say creating a healthier planet that can, to your point, exist within planetary boundaries while feeding the world, then we've hamstrung that goal, and everybody loses.
Right. I mean, the part of the problem is when we show up, we basically make our agenda their problem versus their agenda.
And exactly. I think that empathy. Sorry, just one more point. Yeah. Sorry. I think coming in with that empathy is so necessary.
Well, it's customizable too.
Exactly.
No farm's the same. I think that's the thing we get stuck on too with our own agenda is, and I said this last night for those who were at the reception, you get hung up on the name Regen Ag. You can call it what you want. It's really about outcomes and very flexible because what works for one producer is not going to work for all. And I think we have to learn that and adapt, right? So that they can adopt things that make sense and get credit for the practices they've been doing for a very long time, right?
And I completely agree. And there was something you said in your opening remarks about, hey, it's not just about carbon. And it reminded me of a demonstration that I saw. I know a couple people in the room were at Honor the Harvest by USFRA earlier this fall, where we saw a demonstration by the rancher who was hosting it. And it was a nice, beautiful soil demonstration. Hey, here's healthy soil that has been part of a larger ecosystem with animals in, and it's pure water once you dump water in it. And that led to this kind of as opposed to like degraded soil that hadn't been part of a larger ecosystem. And it was just a nice visual encapsulation. And the way that it was framed was, look, we didn't go after this goal of this particular soil and saying, we're going to do X, Y, Z to get there. We are not making this about practices because, to your point, Jess, everything has to be customizable. It has to be, multimodal. Cover crops will work in some parts of the country, but not other countries. And that's why it has to be about principles, not practices. And that's a quote attributable to Meredith Ellis, who's a rancher. She's spoken at COP28. She's one of the great voices in ag, I think, and it comes from a producer perspective. Definitely follow her. But yeah, principles over practices, I think, is an essential part of this as well.
One comment I'd make on this too, why I'm interested in how this coalition works is having Missouri Farm Bureau, Illinois Farm Bureau, and those institutions that are educating, obviously, and collaborating with the farmers. So I just came from San Francisco last night and had 100 franchisees, multi-generational, 40, 50 years in the business, and we were sitting around how to actually improve their business, right? Best practices, various different things, and light bulbs turning off in minds that have been doing this for decades, right? And I think it's really important that, to the points that have been made by the other speakers here, there are a lot of good expertises out there, but there's still other new innovative ideas, and new generations are getting into farming, and so this coalition has the ability to educate, right, these professionals in this room and the smart people that are going to be coming up with these great ideas to maybe break through that it's okay to do cover crops, and this is going to do X, Y, and Z for the economies of my ground and the economies and the efficiencies and so forth too. So I do believe we've got a duty to help maybe break through the old habits, which will probably help us get to the objectives that we've got, obviously, institutionally across the system. So.
Yeah. So we're going to have after this a panel of growers, and I really want our growers to be ready to help complement what you heard here,
Yep.
or say this conversation missed a few things. It'll be great to have you guys come and do that. So be ready. One of the things that we are doing, recognizing through our coalition, is that it's going to take a massive amount of investment and innovation to build a more regenerative system. The system we have today was built over hundreds of years.
Right.
It runs like a fine-tuned Swiss watch. It's really designed to deliver high quality at a low cost. And you just can't make change like this overnight and throw this thing off. So we're going to have a lot of investment and innovation. And today, as we observe, not just the amount being insufficient, but the pace of adoption of innovation is slow.
Right.
And so we got to solve for that. And that's one of the things we said is the mission of our coalition. We're going to take a new approach, a coalition-centered versus a siloed approach. So Jess, I'd love to have you talk about this concept of a coalition innovation test bed, where we are leveraging the competencies of the entire chain to define what we need, source it, evaluate it, and then scale it, versus our siloed approach today. Help the folks understand why y'all are bought into that as an approach that we should be doing.
Yeah, when we first started talking together, I think one of the most common pain points as I've been out and about, whether it's with NGOs, government agencies, private industry, academics, and producers, is we don't have the right proof points in the system testing. I think each of us individually are pretty good about testing like specific products or variables. Where it gets complicated if you're a producer is you got the whole system to manage. It's not just one product. You got to make a lot of choices. You got to have the right combinations. There's environmental changes. Obviously, every season's different. So what we started talking about is that's expensive to try to do your own product development and testing, as well as then like what other components do you need to really make this more of a regenerative system? Think of, and in my mind, and when we talk at Sparrow, it's like multi-crop, multi-year technology systems, right? So you have the season-long approach, and then it's a multiple-year process. So we said, wouldn't it be great if we had a way to do that accelerated testing? Because that sometimes is what the bottleneck is, at least for us, and making decisions and advancing things, is how do we test, and what's good enough too, by the way. You're never gonna have every situation identified, but what's good enough to say, okay, this proof of concept could really work, let's move it to the next level of scale, right? So we all have strengths, we all have footprints, we all have know-how, so how do we work together in a smarter way to bring in more innovation for you inventors out there to test in systems faster and in a transparent way where we could see the data together, right? So in a pre-competitive notion, I think this is very doable. That would really be one of the first steps, I think, to help us accelerate. And I think our farmers, our producers need this, because going back to some of these challenges of change, we have to mitigate risk too. I think the expectation that farmers are just gonna make these changes and take a yield hit, because sometimes that's what happens when you start changes for 2 to 3 to 5 years, is ridiculous. So I think the other thing we need to do is how do we come together to help mitigate risk for the producers, financially, from knowledge transfer, and listen, right? What's working, what's not working. So having the grower's voice in this test bed is going to be really, really critical to help us make decisions faster about what's going to work, what's not. Let's switch this out. Let's pivot here. The other thing I think this coalition can do is be the voice for innovation. And the voice for innovation is broader than what we think. It's not just in our industry, it's up and down the value chain. Innovation's what's going to accelerate change. And so we want to make sure we're heard and we're collectively heard, whether it be for policymakers and regulations, to one of your opening comments, right? So what we don't want to do is say, hey, a sustainable production system, sustainable sourcing, sustainable or regenerative ag doesn't include modern innovation, because that could happen in certain geographies and from a policy standpoint. So the more that we can bring in a broader subset of voices to this story will help our producers and help the planet, quite honestly, to produce more with less. So for me, the testing part is a big opportunity to work together as a coalition.
And I want our innovators that are in this audience to take this very important message, which is, I know for all of us, it's really frustrating when you've developed the technology and you're ready to scale, and you find yourself in each individual conversation as a one-off. And if you were successfully adopted, it doesn't mean the next person is going to adopt. They're going to take you through the same process. And it is slow and it's inefficient. And by the way, the evaluation is siloed. So it's actually not thinking about the end-to-end conditions under which this solution needs to live. What we are hoping to do at this coalition is build a expertise that is the sum of what is at the table, which is the growers and our major organizations. And then be able to say, if this thing works in our combined wisdom, we got to scale fast. There is no more another committee and another review out there that needs to be involved in evaluating. We got to scale fast. And if we are able to do that, then capital will come, innovation will come, and that front-end de-risking that Jess is talking about, that capital will come. Why will that capital come? Because it knows to do that is to speed up what happens later. So Jess talking about helping farmers de-risk for the first 2 to 3 years, that's not a gimme. This is not charity. It's a smart business decision to increase the pace of adoption. That is what we are trying to change with our coalition. So just wanted to just kind of anchor on what Jess was talking about. Joel, from your perspective, I want you to address the skepticism that might be in the room. How in the heck are these guys who are not historically good at collaborating, right? And you know, you came with that skepticism, but in that first meeting, you threw the gauntlet on this topic. How are we going to overcome the inherent lack of trust that we have with, are we competing? Should we be collaborating? And I'll give you a great example. The whole MMRV space, the idea that a farmer can handle 6 or 7 different MMRV systems does not match reality.
Right.
And yet there are people who think they're going to build their own walled garden of an MMRV system and make it so competitive and attractive that they can make venture-backed returns for something like that.
Right.
So using that as an example, Joel, what's the way to address the skepticism? What gives you hope that we are going to take a different approach and this approach is going to work?
Yeah, so great question, Vijay. So as you think about the industry has been pretty plagued with antitrust, obviously a lot of activity happening in protein antitrust, whether it's poultry, whether it's beef, whether it's pork. And so that obviously has everybody guarded from different brands of how we work together. And so if you think about Burger King, first thing that comes to mind is probably Whopper, second maybe a Crown, and then somewhere in the top 3 you're thinking McDonald's, right? I mean, it's just the reality of just how your brain kind of works. And so, so we've been competitors for 60 years, but at the same token, this is clearly something pre-competitive, right? So it's already been happening. We've had numerous meetings with them, as well as other parties such as Wendy's and Dairy Queens and so forth. We've all got the same goals to achieve, right? And we've got this huge target that's been set respectfully, and some of us have a much more aggressive target in 2030, and then some 2050 as well too. So that collaboration's already been taking place. It's interesting. We're all sending various different sustainability questionnaires to our suppliers, and they're crying is like, if you guys just ask the same questions, this would be a lot easier for us, right? Because we've got our 50 questions, they've got their 80 questions, and so forth. So we're actually meeting now. What can we do to just streamline this to make it easier? Because if we're distracting our suppliers from ensuring supply at best cost and obviously quality and so forth, and filling out all these things in these various different versions and so forth, that's problematic as well too. We've done some collaboration with various different projects with NIFWIF and others as well too, so that's already happened. So there's no question for us to actually achieve the objectives and for our competitors to achieve the objectives, we're going to have to do this together collectively, and it's really going to be pre-competitive. I don't envision that regulatory-wise is going to look at this as a antitrust-related topic, because we're trying to solve something that's bipartisan, right? If there's few things that, the Republicans and Democrats are going to be there on the Hill here in a few weeks, and we're going to be advocating on things that are important to our business. This is the common place that there's even ground there, that they obviously realize this is important to the investment community, important to the consumers, that we solve this collectively together. And so we believe that we can get there faster. We can do more acres, we can get more funding, and we can get more ideas, and obviously get to the consumer in a much better way and quicker way by collectively doing it together.
Thank you, Joel. So as you can tell, we are identifying in our coalition those areas where it doesn't make any sense for us to have competition when we should be collaborating. And once we identify that, we want to be able to leverage the expertise and make it work on an end-to-end basis. This is why having the producers on the front end is so important, because they're going to ground truth what's going to work for them on the farm. And if it doesn't work for them on the farm, then it doesn't matter what we want the system to look like on the other side. On the other side, we have the consumer, as you were talking about, Joel. We have a very split consumer. On Mondays, they wake up and want the most sustainable system, and on Tuesday, they wake up and say, I want it at the cheapest price. Right? So how do we connect that side of it to this? This is the challenge that we are involved in on the coalition. Mac, I'd love to hear from where y'all sit at USB, and as you talk to our producers, what is their sense of what is not being understood by all the partners today showing up and having this conversation with your producers and with the organization? What is it that they're missing? I'd love to have the audience, because there is a framing that our farmers don't get it, right? That's sort of how they say it. We see it, it's clear, they don't get it. So obviously,
That's a good answer, Mac.
the reality is our value chain doesn't get it. What don't they get?
Yeah, it's, now I got to exercise my inner Dikembe Mutombo there. That was fun. Yeah, that perception, and this goes back to my comment about, farmers being 2% of the population, and for, so much of us, those of us in the room, we're closer to farmers than most of the population. But that doesn't mean that we're necessarily close to farmers and truly understand the mentality. Again, I'll never be a farmer. I'll never be able to truly empathize and understand what it is like to live that life day to day. I know that it's hard enough that I could never do it. So I think when we get decoupled from, part of a supply chain, farmers, just as an example, when it's hidden from us, it's very easy to undervalue everything that happens at that node. And it's also easy to undervalue the expertise and the decision science that has been arrived at through generations and generations and years and years and years of farming, which is not to say doing things the old way is the best way, but that there is a lot of institutional knowledge. Farmers are not stupid. Farmers are not yokels. Farmers are not people who are not sound business people. And so I think when we talk about collaboration and really effective collaboration, it starts from a point of mutual respect. And this applies to the consumer end too. I think that one of the things that is very easy to get caught up in is the notion that, we've got this product that we're going to sell to farmers, we need to educate the farmer on it. Or we've got, these products, or we're generating demand at the consumer level because we believe this is what they want, we're gonna educate the consumer. If you have those two ends of the value chain being educated, that's a one-way train of information. That's a one-way train of expertise. It is not democratizing the experience and the potential for collaboration. I'd say having awareness and a foundational mutual respect when there's an approach, it's like, look, here's what we think your pain points are, farmer or consumer, in terms of what you want. Here's what we have to offer. Let's go back and forth. So I'd say the approach there is really foundationally important. The other thing I want to say is, and this goes into how we take things for granted. You mentioned the food system really being kind of set up over the last century. I mean, in the post-World War II period, our share of expenditure on food, I think, has gone from 40+% to under 10% in the United States. That is absolutely a fundamental success, and I think part of the reason, why America's been so prosperous in the post-World War II period. But there are, of course, knock-on and unintended consequences of that, and I think one of the unintended consequences of that is that we expect low-cost, high-volume production, and from a farmer perspective, that means you're always operating in a commodity mindset. And if you're in a commodity mindset, it is about getting trapped in a margin game. And that pressure is what's coming to farmers. Input costs rise, commensurate with commodity price movement. The willingness to pay downstream gets compressed because you're used to cheap food. So, we're talking about this spatially. How do we operate across the value chain? But I think there's also a time component. We're at a pace now where, yes, the global population is growing, but the pace at which it's growing is slowing too. China, for example, a couple of years of population decline here. So how do we think about moving from a truly volume-based system where value accrues in pockets that aren't commensurate with the risk being borne by that respective member of the value chain, i.e. farmers? How do we move from that to one that's truly value-oriented? And that's what I think, everything that's moving around regenerative agriculture and trying to uncover new pockets of value there, and the innovators, like those of you in this room who are, seeking to provide solutions that help unlock all of that. It's absolutely a critical piece, but I think it's also an inflection point where we think about, hey, how does food systems actually kind of transform moving forward? And we get to more of this value-based approach, because that is an opportunity for everybody, farmers to consumers.
Great. In a few minutes that we have left, anybody with a burning question and a hard question for this group? I don't want any softball questions. Give a tough one. Anybody wanting to ask a question that you've been wanting to?
Farmers are for profit, so it really comes down to the economics. And if we're talking about creating value, farmers are producing a commodity output. Where do we share the value? How do we make sure that it makes sense for them? I see the issue with existing carbon programs today. It costs $40 to plant a cover crop, and I get $10, $15 maybe in return. So low adoption, not a big surprise. So, I love the talk about farmer as the partner. They own the factory. That's where we're all looking to source things from. But how do we make sure that, volume-based business here in the heartland, we're not producing specialty products, that we share in the value, and then it becomes sustainable, right? It can be profitable for them, profitable for our companies, and it's adopted. Maybe
I can start with that one. As Bayer, our position on regenerative ag, the first thing is productivity and profitability of the grower. And it was somewhat controversial with certain groups when we led with that. They're like, oh, this shouldn't just be about yield and profit. And we're like, of course it is. So to your point, if we don't design systems that actually have a return on investment for growers, it won't be adopted, period. And so that's why I think this collective innovation is so critical. It's not just one product. You got to have a suite of options, because a cover crop might make sense or it might not make sense depending on what you're growing and where you grow it. So it's got to be that combination, and the data's got to be there in that system approach to do the math. The equitable value share is super tough, and this is why we need more transparency, so that by the time it gets down to Joel and then the consumer, you have this equitable value share. That's, to me, one of the big challenges that we have to solve, from our grower all the way down to consumer. How do we have more of an equitable share? Because you're spot on. If we don't do that, it won't work. But I think we're seeing little glimmers of hope, but the system approach has to be there for the grower.
And that's what makes this coalition such an important one, because we're going to have in the conversation, how is the value being created and how is it being shared across the value chain? Otherwise, it doesn't scale.
It
right,
won't
to your
scale,
point.
yeah.
So we are up on time here. I just want to thank this awesome panel for being vulnerable and straight with these difficult questions and conversations, and looking forward to what comes next. The next conversation is going to be with a panel of growers, continuing the conversation we just started.
Perfect.
Round of applause to Jess, Joel, and Mac.